Hello, welcome back, traveler. You must be here for another story. Well, then let me tell you a story that happened right after the Dawnbringer Crusades. A story I had previously told you. This story is not like any other I have told you so far. This one is more of a cautionary tale of how vicious and brutal the Aurochs were, especially the ones who called themselves the Cruel Boys. But this will also be a tale of bravery and how any man could be a hero despite of any previous faults done, as well as what makes a holy relic. This story is about brave women and men who gave their lives for a few. This is the Thunderstrike expedition.
Was a mortal priest, a dear friend of mine, someone I considered very wise. He had this tendency to call me Lord, even though I kept telling him I was no Lord, I was a knight. We had many conversations, but our last, before departing to my expedition that would turn out one of my deadliest, was a profound one. He could somehow noticed something was bothering me. A guilt of sorts. A guilt of being reforged into this new form, in this new Thunderstrike armor, as the Dwarven Smith God calls it. Yet somehow, even through my helmet, he could see through me, and that I was at a loss as to why I was chosen and not my fallen brothers in arms. I can remember the words he told me then, as if it was just yesterday.
I've been a soldier in my time, long before I was a priest. I've had soldiers in here, crying for dead friends. I know what it's like to lose a comrade in arms. It's a loss that can never be filled, forms as it is of grief and guilt both. But I understood that you're kind. Well, death is not the end, is it? You return, reforged by the will of Sigmar. It is true that the God King fashions his tools to his purpose. It's not always given to us to understand why.
To hear such words coming from a mortal was profound to me. It made me question why indeed the God King chose me to wear this armor, to be this new generation of Knight Relectors. Would I ever know? And why do I feel this guilt inside me? I am the will of the God King. I should not feel this way, but I do. I've had a recurring dream ever since I was reforged. One where I'm falling with fallen comrades from who knows where, or even when. They feel like a faint memory, something that maybe happened or maybe didn't. It's of a vague time. The only concrete is of a corpuscent blur of the lightning, the anvil that lava beneath me, and the agony of being reforged. There is no history behind me, not even memory. There was only pain, and these vague impressions of sacrifice. Everything must be taken on trust. It is all we have. It is, indeed, all we have. We Stormcast can be reforged so many times we lose everything that once made us mortals. We do Sigmar's will and trust that he has a plan to end this war. I remember the praetors of Lord Tyrannus, and he exemplified what we could become. If we are reforged over and over again, sometimes I wonder how old he really was. Forged and reforged, returning always to his master, each time with a little more of his master's soul taking the place of his own. They were old beings, the praetors. They were forged only when sufficient numbers of them had died, so that the bonds of brotherhood was never broken. Warriors out of time. Decades could have passed since this particular praetor last set foot on the mortal realms, soon losing everything that made them who they once were. And one day, this could be us, being but a mere weapon and nothing else. Before I departed to my expedition to find the lost company of Free Guild from the Iron Poles, to figure out exactly what happened to them, and if we are lucky, find any refugees or survivors of both the company and the settlement, where we have lost communications with. Jonas, my friend, gave me a curious object, an object that at the moment I found to be unimportant, but later it would make me question what I know. This object was a sword. You see, being an Knight Relictor, I carry with me relics, sacred relics, from previous martyrs and saints that now impute these objects with the holy power of Sigmar, and could help us in battle. But he handed me this sword, a standard sword, for a mortal soldier, from a young man who had fallen in battle defending Excelsis. Jonas told me that day.
His name was Richard Strachan, a good lad, a common guardsman, none too special if the truth be told, just an ordinary boy. But he was willing to lay down his life for Excelsis when the time came. I want you to have it. Take it with you on your next campaign. A relic, not of a great saint or martyr, but of an ordinary young man who gave in the end all that he had to give. It is holy in its way. I hope it will help you.
Even though I knew this was not a holy relic, and possibly this young man who had no doubt died in some squalid and desperate fashion. This was the sword of a scared boy pressed to service because he had no other choice. It was not given to everyone to be a hero, but for some reason, I took it. I took it with me, for I trusted John and his wisdom. But as John said, the temple is not the building. It is the people who meet in it. That is Sigmar's empire, the people. I left the temple that day, and it was the last time I saw John, my friend. Taken from the letters of Knight Relictor Actinus.
Once this Knight Relictor got the order from the Lord Imperator Tyrannus to go and search for the missing company of Free Guild from the Iron Wolves and to see what happened to the settlements that have stopped contacting Excelsis, he immediately set out to the swamps of Gur, where the settlements were established. He left with 20 vigilators who would be their scouts and pathfinders, a unit of vindicators, and behind them 2 small units of annihilators and vanquishers, and of course a knight judicator named Lita and her 2 griffhounds, and a knight Vexilor standing tall with his banner waving at the wind. They marched forth into the swamps, into a place they never knew it would be so deadly. They marched for days and they finally reached Palmer's Creek, the first of the human settlements. They were sent to look out to see what happened, and what they feared was true. The settlement was abandoned. It had some signs of trouble, but nothing concrete. Windows were shattered and broken. Doors were as well broken. No sign as to who could have done it, or if it was a violent, since they never found any blood anywhere. All they found was a glyph that looked to be an orc-like, but it was not of any orc clan they recognized. It was a mystery within a mystery. Suddenly, they hear the screams coming from outside, and the screams suddenly turn into sobs. When they go out to figure out what is happening, they notice two mortals being carried into the camp by a vigilator. Two men who would be important to figure out what happened in the settlement. Once they figured out who the two men were, they turned out to be the captain of the Iron Bulls, who was named Holgerbeck, and a mortal priest that accompanied the company of Iron Bulls. Once the captain was well in mind to speak, he told part of the story as to what happened to their company. And as he told the story, the Night Relector could see and feel the fear of the captain. But his story seemed not real because it's not something they could not believe. He writes clearly what the captain said in his letters.
We tried pressing through the scrubs on the path from Excelsis, as you did, but it was too difficult. We tracked further north until we met the channel coming out of Morik Hills. Gods. Then we were hit. Ghost I thought at first. Pale, wavering in the gloom like haunted faces, peering at us, screeching. But they were real enough. Solid enough to hold a blade and a string of bow. I didn't get a good look at first. I tried to lead some of the survivors back towards the raft. Tried to make a fight and withdraw. Anyways, in moments, we were overwhelmed. Something knocked me out, and when I came to, we were chained together, forced on through the swamps in the torchlight. They weren't swamp spirits. I could see that. More like they were orcs. I'm sure of it. But not like any we have ever seen before. Blank, dripping things lopping through the mire as if they were born to it. Swimming through the water like frogs, face painted white. Some of them are holding these shields with these awful leering things painted on them. The way they moved us, the way they talked, I couldn't understand it. But you could tell they were making plans, that they had a strategy of some kind. That night march was one of the worst of my life. Any stragglers were hamstrung and left in the swamps to die, eaten by those leopard eels that they thrashed us in the... And if you cried out, they'll cut your throat. I know green screens are a brutal race, but this was something else. This wasn't even cruelty. It was just pragmatism. At night, they tracked some of us to fight, 2 at a time. A ring of torches, a bow knife tossed between you. If you refused, they cut your hands off, and they ate them in front of you. Everyone fought after that. I fought. Sigmar helped me. They were laughing, if you could call it laughter, hacking and gurging away to themselves, sitting beyond the torchlight. Just these pale, wavering faces grinning at us. I thought we were going to starve then. One evening at dusk, they opened the cages and dragged about half of the survivors out. Civilians and soldiers, shackled them all together, and then they they bound the others together, and they cut out their tongues one by one. That's the image I'm left with. That pile of severed tongues glistening in the torchlight. They marched them off into the swamps, heading to Sigmar knows where. And then one of the orcs, lopped over at the cage and grinding at us those horrible yellow tusks, the white paint flaking on his face. It mimed eating. You know, dipping its finger to its open hand and raising them to its mouth. And it said something like, in speech, some horrible parody of it. It said, hungry. And it picked up all those tongues and threw them at the cages. I hadn't eaten in days. Do you understand? Sigmar, forgive me. I hadn't eaten in days.
Indeed, the way the captain explained what these orcs did does not sound like any orcs they had known at the time. These were not a dumb, strong kind of orcs. This was a cunning and sadistic kind of orc. Therefore, in the beginning, they did not believe the captain. The only thing they trusted was that, more than likely, the captain was a spineless coward who wants to create a story to cover his back, and who more than likely left his comrades behind to save himself. He begged the Stormcast to turn back and abandon their quest, but the Stormcast ignored him and decided that their mission is more important now that they know that there is survivors out there, and they also needed to know what happened here and if the other settlements were also in the same condition. But the captain was adamant that they turn back, and he admitted that he was a coward and he left his comrades behind to save himself, just as the Night Relictor thought. But that is when he remembered about his old friend, Jonas, and he writes that he told the captain of the Iron Bulls the following.
Twice you have chosen to dishonor your regiment and dishonor your soul. Let the third choice be the one that redeems them all. This is a sacred relic from one of the temples of Sigmar. It was given to me by a priest I know, a great man, and a great servant of Sigmar. Take it, please. I believe it will help you. It belonged to a young officer called Aldert Somer. He was much as you are, untried, selfish perhaps, not a brave man. But during the siege, when the moment came and his comrades and his city were threatened, he drew on a wall of courage he didn't know he possessed. His men were dead around him, he was alone, but he held the bridge at Stormstone Cross as long as it took for his regiment to withdraw. When the first breach in the bastion was made, he was outnumbered 10-1, but he fought with every ounce of his strength until he was cut down. He saved the lives of hundreds of men and women. He was a hero, and his heroism sacralized that blade I give to you now to aid you in your struggle. Use it, Captain Beck. Draw strength from it. Honor it.
Even if he knew it was a lie, he knew it was for the greater good, and maybe something can come out of it. He gave the sword to the captain, and he immediately noticed that this normal sword gave bravery to the captain, but he could not understand why, since this was not a real relic. The captain now decided to join the expedition to save his comrades. But before they left, one of the Gryph-hounds was still out, and Lita, the Night Judicator, was worried, since the two hounds were inseparable. Aside from not having the hound return, they now knew they were being watched, but they didn't know by what, but it was certain someone was watching them. Now they marched out of the settlement, and the moment they set foot on the swamps, a heavy fog appeared, and it seemed like it was following them, and it did not feel natural. And that is when the captain of the Iron Bulls told them that this was the orcs' doings. Before getting captured, he saw an orc pouring some poisons and elixirs into a huge cauldron and creating this mist that also seemed unbelievable to the Stormcast, since that was not known to be done by the orcs. Then, out of nowhere, a scream is heard from up ahead, and they see that Lita is screaming in sadness and anger, and with her bow ready to fire, but they did not know why. And that is when they see it. It was the Griff Hound, nailed to the tree with its head cut off and disemboweled, with its intestines reaching out all the way to the floor in an act of cruelty and a taunt against the Stormcast. Lita was angry and ready to kill whatever it was that had done this. There was fire of revenge in her eyes, but the Night Relictor managed to calm her down and tell her she would get her vengeance in time. For now, it was time to keep moving. They need to get to the settlement and look for survivors. Once they had reached the fort, they did not head out in the open at first, since the mysterious fog is still following them and they still felt the eyes in the swamps following them as well. From far out in their lookout, they noticed the silhouettes of figures out in the watchtower, and that is when they decided to walk out and make the presence known. And that is when they noticed it. That the silhouettes were impaled corpses of the guards, their spears and swords lashed to the wrist, steel helmets rakishly askewed on rotten heads. The Stormcast were shocked to what they were witnessing, but they don't let this sight falter their goal, and they break into the gate and go inside and find some of the survivors in cages and some of the soldiers of the Iron Bulls. They were glad that they were still alive, even if they were not unharmed, but at least they were alive. Their moments of happiness was disturbed by the sound of a sudden whooping call coming from the mist and it surrounding the fort. Now they knew it was time for battle, time to finally see this threat. They waited for hours for the attack to commence, but it never came. They would assume that the attack would come from the north, since it's where most of the open space was, and more logical place to attack, but suddenly they could hear that in fact the southern wall was being attacked. Lita, who was standing guard with the Night Relictor, jumped down and headed to the southern wall, but it is as they feared. These orcs were cunning, and they actually pretended to attack the southern wall, and as they realized what was happening, they heard a large explosion and found themselves soaring through the air, and with their ears ringing as they hit the ground, they could see the ground littered with shattered wood, and also some of the Vindictors laying dazed on the ground, as well as one of them tried to stand, his arm and half of his face missing, his armor torn apart by the blast from the unholy contraption that blazed in the hands of the orcs. And indeed, they were orcs now that they had seen them with their own eyes. But unlike the orcs of the Iron Jaws or the Bone Splitter clans, who were more like animals, crude and aggressive beasts that lived for war, these were different. They were smart, they were strategic, and they had different kind of armor and even weapons. One of them especially caught the eye of the Night Relictor as he writes in his letters.
This clearly was a grenade-like weapon, akin to the way the Dwarden of the Caradon were known to make. But where could these orcs be getting Dwarden-made weapons? Have the Caradons betrayed Sigmar in search for profit? What is this mystery surrounding this weapon? Questions from a mystery that could only deepen once looked out for.
As the battle raged on, the Night Relictor noticed that the captain of the Iron Bulls was nowhere to be found. In fact, he had cowered again and was hiding. And that is when the Night Relictor got angered. He writes in his letters, he told the captain of the Iron Bulls,
"Get up and fight! Raise that sword into its holy purpose. If you will not, then give it to someone who will make better use of it than you."
But this did not ignite the fire that the captain needed, and still cowered in the battle. The sword maybe was not a holy relic after all. Even if it came from a lie, maybe relics do come from acts of bravery only. Once the battle was done, they realized that they would have to make a retreat to Exodus, for if they stay, they would surely die. At least if they move, they have a fighting chance to make it out, even if it's a small one. They gathered the necessary provisions that could find, and it was time to march out into the open and hope they could somehow survive. But they would soon come out to realize that this was the worst plan ever. For every step that they would take, they could hear the steps and chirping of the orcs coming from the fog that was following them, and the line of Stormcast and Free Guild were trying to keep as many people alive as possible. But they were being constantly bombarded by either grenades or arrows. Every now and then the orcs would attack and a fight would ensue. But once the battle seemed lost for the orcs, they would retreat back into the fog. And just as the caravan of Stormcast and mortals would move, they would immediately get fired by grenades and arrows once more. Many men were killed, even Stormcast, and by now, they had been walking for hours and even days. And even though the Stormcats could walk for far longer before getting tired, the mortal men were not like them. And this is where they would have to make the most difficult decision of their lives, especially for the Knight Relector, who in his own way loved every mortal and respected them. That decision was that if a mortal were to drop from exhaustion, they made the collective decision to not help him or her get up, therefore they would be left behind for a sure death. Just as the mortal would plead to the Stormcast not to leave them behind, they had to ignore them and they felt the pain. The Knight Relector writhed at the moment. He thought to himself,
And yet, I could not carry them. I could not. And then, 100 yards further into the pestilence glade, as we moved away, we could hear them, screaming. And, in the distance, I had to tell myself, it must be the leopard eels. But sadly, I knew it was far worse.
Yet, they continued. They moved for days, constantly being showered by arrows and losing men and Stormcast alike. Finally, they had reached their tipping point. They were losing too many people. Now they had to make a last stand. So the Knight Relector used a holy relic that cleared the fog, and they used this chance to make a run for it. But they were very close to reaching the open field where no doubt those damn orcs could lose the upper hand and stop attacking like those damn Skavenkin. But in a sad moment, the Knight Relector recounts that his comrade Lita was struck by an arrow that splintered through her throat. But in one last act of salvation, Lita shot an arrow to the sky that would react as a beacon to whomever could see it. This is when they knew maybe no one was coming and they were all going to die. So they decided to make a last stand the next day, for if they die, they would take down as many damn orcs as possible. There were only now a dozen Free Guild left alive, and all of them had now resigned to death, and the Knight Relector was bleeding from a dozen wounds and only a handful of Vindicators, Vanquishers, and Annihilators left. They all knew they would fall that day. Even now, the captain of the Iron Bulls was holding his holy relic sword up as he was a changed man. He was now pulling strength from the sword. They all shouted, "For Sigmar!" And the orcs came swarming on, and it was a great battle. Orcs, mortals, and Stormcast alike were falling, and shouts of pain could be heard in the battlefield, all possessed by the battle madness. The Knight Relector was stabbed repeatedly, but he would not fall as the battle raged on. And finally, the Knight Relector got an answer as to who these orcs were. These were the cruel boys, as they called themselves. But he got his answer too late. They were now outnumbered, and most of them were injured or too tired to keep fighting. And now, to make matters worse, the warlord of the cruel boys had arrived with its giant bird-like monster. And just as they thought that they had no more energy to fight, the once cowardly captain of the Iron Bulls launched forward with the sword at hand and attacked the giant bird and stabbed it. And this invigorated the Free Guild and Stormcast, and they began to fight once more. This stunned the orcs, but soon began to regain the control over the battlefield. But this act of bravery by the captain was long enough for the sudden appearance of Lord Imperator Tyrannus and the golden host of the Tyrannite Chamber. The arrow that Lita shot to the sky was seen by the Lord Tyrannus, and the bravery of the Captain Beck was their saving grace, as they are now guaranteed to survive, since this attack was enough to make the orcs retreat. When the battle was over, the Knight Relector looked around the battlefield, and one of the fallen men was the captain of the Iron Bulls. and in his hand he was firmly still holding the sword. And that is when he writes, "The sergeant of the Iron Bull said, I never thought I'll live to see it. Captain Beck, a hero." But the Knight Relector knew that no one is made a hero. Instead, one must choose to be one instead. They had survived this hell. They had survived this expedition. Many were lost, but at least they managed to save a few, and that was enough for them. After returning to Excelsius, the Knight Relector wanted to see his old friend Jonas, but he found out Jonas had peacefully passed away, and now there was a new priest in the temple. This saddened the battle-weary Knight Relector. He had lost a friend once more, and one day, with the passage of time and reforging, maybe he would forget his friend, he feared. But he knew John would say otherwise. He writes down that he looked at the sword and remembered those wise words he said, that this sword was a relic. In his way to say goodbye to his friend and the temple, he tells the new priest,
I bring this for the benefit of the temple. It's a great relic, a holy weapon used in Sigmar's cause. Jonas gave it to me, and I in turn gift it back to you, more sacred than it was before. This blade belonged to a man called Holger Beck, the captain of the Iron Bulls. He stood undaunted against the darkness. He saved my life. He was a hero. Remember him. Let it remain here where it can be seen. Let it remain among the people.
And the Knight Relector walked away and said goodbye to that place. And now he had a better understanding of the true power of relics, especially when it comes to giving hope to the people. And this is where my story ends, dear traveler. In this story, take it as a cautionary tale. If you walk among the swamps of Gur, remember, avoid the fog and hope for the best, or avoid the swamps altogether at all costs. For this was the Thunderstrike expedition.